Thank you so much for joining us today for this episode of HeartStrong TV. I'm Rebecca Carrell, your host, and joining me today is one of the contributors for a book called Vindicating the Vixens, Sarah Bowler. Sarah got her THM, her master's in theological studies at Dallas Theological Seminary, and you were initially drawn to Bathsheba for thesis work. Sarah wrote the chapter in Vindicating the Vixens on Bathsheba. So tell us what drew you to Bathsheba in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was trying to decide on what topic to choose for my thesis, I spent quite a bit of time thinking it over because I wanted it to be a topic that I would enjoy and something that would be practical because I knew I'd have to spend a lot of hours doing research for it. And as I was in the midst of trying to decide, I listened to part of a sermon series by a very well-known preacher. And he was talking about one of my favorite Bible characters, but he basically came out and painted her as a terrible person. And I completely disagreed with his interpretation. So it got me thinking, what other women in the Bible are perhaps being interpreted unfairly in their stories? And one of the people that came to mind was Bathsheba, because whether it's through books, paintings, movies, or preachers, she's kind of gotten a very bad reputation, and I wasn't sure if that was entirely deserved. So I wanted to delve deeper into her story, and the more I did so, the more convinced I became that her story, as it really happened, needs to be told.
That is the premise of the book, Vindicating the Vixens. Each chapter is dedicated to a female in Scripture who has been portrayed in a way that is not quite accurate. And I, too, listening to a very popular female Bible teacher, heard her paint this picture of Bathsheba as laying naked on the roof of her house, bathing in a provocative manner, tempting King David. But as your research showed, that's not what happened at all.
No. And actually, when you say that, that's probably one of the most frequent questions I get asked when people find out that I've done some research and writing on Bathsheba. They come and they say, okay, so tell me, why was she bathing naked on top of her roof? You know, it's a common question. And the first thing I always say is, okay, first off, she was not on top of her roof. The only person on top of the roof in the story was King David, as he was on top of his palace roof looking down over the city from his vantage point. Most likely she was in an enclosed courtyard area of her own home. And, well, she might have been naked. We don't really know for sure. We kind of have this Western idea when we hear the word bathing. We think, oh, bathing, of course, you know, you get completely undressed. Not necessarily the case. She could have been just bathing her hands, maybe her feet, maybe she removed her veil and was bathing her face. We just don't know exactly what was going on there with that. But whatever the case, you know, she's not brazenly bathing on top of her roof for all to see.
And then in the book, you make a very interesting point that we need to remember. When David saw Bathsheba, he sent for her, so she did not volunteer herself up. David sent for her with not one palace guard, but two palace guards. So what does that say to us?
Right, and actually, we don't really get the exact number. It doesn't even say two. It just says plural.
Plural.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
more than one.
You know, I hear that and I think several. So maybe it was 3, maybe it was 10. You know, whatever. A bunch of palace guards show up and say the king wants to see you. So basically, he fetched her. Wasn't her going willingly to the palace, as we often like to kind of paint the picture of.
And a lot of people at this point will say, but you always have a choice. She didn't have to go. And here she is. Her husband is away at war. Her husband is a close friend of the king. Is that right? Or
Yes, he was one of his mighty men. Uriah was one of his close, trusted advisors. Yes, that's true.
And so Bathsheba really had no reason at this point to distrust King David.
True. I mean, she didn't necessarily know why she was being summoned, but even if she did, she didn't really have the opportunity to say no. I mean, one woman against several men, if she said no, they're going to take her anyway.
Now, one of the things that Sarah discusses in this book is the victim nature of this whole incident. And when I almost don't want to say we, but when we hear people and teachers and pastors talking about Bathsheba, what we often hear is David had an affair. So was this a consensual affair from what we know that the text says? Can we infer that?
No, it would be more accurate to say David raped Bathsheba. And when we say affair, we're basically giving Bathsheba partial blame in that. And the more I researched it, the more my understanding of her story was Bathsheba was completely 100% a victim here.
So this is actually revolutionary for a lot of us, the idea that Bathsheba was a rape victim, which makes David a rapist along with a murderer. And first of all, I'm overwhelmed with the grace of God that he uses messed up and broken people, because messed up and broken people are all he has to work with. But tell me why this is important for us today. Why is it important for us to have a right understanding of the story of Bathsheba and King David?
Well, so often I think that how we interpret the stories in the Bible is a reflection of what's going on around us. And so often we're quick to try to sugarcoat or justify King David in this story when we should be acting like the prophet Nathan and confronting sin head on. As I study the story, I was just hit anew with God's heart for the vulnerable, for the marginalized, and for those who are victims of sexual abuse. And God is calling us today to be a voice for those who don't have a voice. And I think part of that is reflected in even how we're presenting stories in the Bible. After I had written some blogs and done some writing about the story, a girl that I had discipled over 10 years ago got back in touch with me, and basically she said, "Sarah, I can't thank you enough for presenting Bathsheba as a victim." And she went on to share some very sad things about how she had been raped, and several leaders in her church had presented her as partially to blame in that situation. And it just devastated her. But hearing stories in the Bible and hearing Bathsheba's story gave her hope, hearing that Bathsheba was also a victim.
Sarah just said something that triggered something with me, is that oftentimes the way we interpret the scriptures is a reflection of the culture that we're in right now. And isn't it almost like we are seeing this play out with the unfolding of the scandals in Hollywood with Harvey Weinstein and countless other actors now being named? And I have heard victim shaming, and maybe not direct blame, but I have heard a lot of language about, well, they dress that way, they parade themselves around this way. But I think the story of Bathsheba and King David is a reminder to us that when there is an unfair or even a fair, I mean, in a king subject situation, it's a fair balance of power. However, when that power is abused, the victim is so often voiceless.
Right.
Well, Well, Sarah Bowler, I'm so grateful that you wrote the chapter on Bathsheba, and I hope that you will pick up a copy of Vindicating the Vixens. It's available now on Amazon, and it really is, it's just an eye-opening read of proper interpretation of biblical stories that you and I have been reading for as long as we've been reading the Bible. But Sarah Bowler wrote the chapter on Bathsheba, and will you tell everyone their blog so that they can follow you personally?
Mm-hmm. It's sarahbowler.com. That's Sarah with an H, S-A-R-A-H, and Bowler is B-O-W-L-E-R.
Thank you so much for being our guest today on HeartStrong TV, and thank you for being with us.